Hey everyone, you're listening to Affirmative Reaction here on SiriusXM Progress Channel 127. I'm your host, Xorje Olivares. Now, I was just telling my guests, Quentin Lee and Bee Vang, that I'm excited to talk about their new film, Comisery, because a lot of us, and those of you who've been listening to my show understand, we are all communicating through Zoom, or at least through any sort of web chat function. And part of that is because of the ease in which we can do it. But I love that Comisery takes what we already know to be true, that we are communicating in this particular way, and uses it for a very fascinating storyline for a brand new sci-fi comedy film that Quentin has directed called, again, Comisery. And it goes into this idea of what happens when we are not physically next to each other, but there's something happening around us. It is set within this idea of COVID and coronavirus. But what happens when something else is lurking behind the corners and causing us to rethink reality? Because I think a lot of us are having that come to Jesus moment where we're talking to ourselves like, is this real? Well, this film definitely kind of makes you second guess the idea of what's real and what's not. And I'm excited to have this conversation specifically with Bee, because Bee's character in the film is gender non-binary, meaning that they don't identify either as male or female. And so I think that adds to a really wonderful topic at hand, which is what happens when we, all of us, from our different backgrounds, from our different identities, from our different lived experiences, what happens when each of us are confronted with something that we just can't explain? So very excited to welcome again Bee and Quentin to talk about Comisery and all sorts of really other fun, cool things. Thank you all so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
So first off, I want to start off with Quentin. Let's say since March, how many Zoom conversations do you think you've been on? And that's excluding what we see in the film, because it is all through web chat.
Actually, quite a lot, because I started March. I was like, actually, I was also working for this nonprofit organization called Yale in Hollywood. And so we started doing a lot of Zoom panels. So I was already tired of Zooming around like March or April. It's just too many of them. And then my friends all want to be on like, Zoom happy hour. I was like, oh my God, that's the worst thing, because it's just, I'm like working all day. So, yeah. And somehow around like, I think April or something, I reconnected with an old friend, a filmmaker friend of mine, Adi Tantamith, who's actually Thai, but he lives in New York. And then he's a novelist, and he wrote 3 novels called the Ravi P.I. series. And I really liked. And so we started chatting. So let's do something together. So I said, okay, well, I kind of interested in doing something on Zoom, because I'm on Zoom so much. And it's such an interesting format also, because, it's kind of new. And my background was an experimental filmmaker. So of course, like I really love to just play with all kinds of like formats and things like that. So we started chatting, and I said, I want to do something like kind of like War of the Worlds. And then Eddie said, oh, it has to be comedic. It can't be like all serious, because I just remember like hearing about the War of the Worlds, like the first broadcast was like everybody thought like there was an alien invasion. They're like, well, let's say there's an alien invasion, and we want to do something about Asian American friends, because since COVID started, there was just so much racism and violence against Asians all over the world. And literally, my friend in Berlin, who's Chinese, and he's a gay filmmaker, and he got harassed in the subway, and somebody started him, Corona, Corona, Corona. And so that issue is always on our mind. So we just wanted to do something kind of fun at the same time as imaginative, that kind of like address, this whole COVID and Asian violence in our own way. And within 2 days, Adi wrote the first pilot. And then I reached out to all the actors, including Bee, that I've met since when he was like 16 or something, after Gran Torino. So, and we just started making it, we started shooting like, every week we'd shoot an episode for maybe 10 minutes or so. And then eventually we initially released it on Facebook. And then once everything's released, I realized that, oh, there's this whole potential to put it together as feature. So I pulled everything, and we shot a little bit more with Bee, and a little bit more with Jennifer Field, and we put it together. Mm-hmm. And basically the crew is just me. It's just me and Adi. And I did all the editing, post sound, everything, color, everything is me.
I love that. I think it's something that I try to explain to my listeners. And part of the reason why I enjoy doing Zoom and having the video on when I have these conversations is you really do get a lot more from somebody when you can see another person there. And it's just like regular interpersonal communication. You feed off of someone else's energy. And yes, we don't get to physically have that energy here, but I'm curious, B, as an actor, as somebody who's trying to feed off the energy of the people that you're working with, how were you able to kind of work with that, considering this was all done digitally?
Right. And I think that so much of what COVID and the lockdown and the pandemic has taught us is precisely how to continue doing the work that we need to do using different and various platforms to allow us to, continue the work. So at first, the process of shooting this and the creative process was a little, like unconventional for all of us. I think we were pretty disoriented by how this would all come together, how it would look. And I think, there was a lot of talking through things and how to use Zoom. And it was just a very promising premise with a great use of technology during the lockdown to really, find the creative energy to build that synergy. And I think we had to work with what we had, and it made for, thinking more creatively, thinking beyond just, what we have been trained to do. So it's been challenging, but it's been a great learning experience for all of us, I would say.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad that you mentioned, Quentin, the idea that it centers on Asian American friends. It's a way to kind of kick back against a lot of the hatred that has happened to that community since coronavirus hit. But I'm curious about if you could talk a little bit about the title itself and why you chose that title to go along with the piece and what you think it says about what people can expect.
Yeah, we were just basically, Adi and I were brainstorming, and then we wanted, we wanted kind of like a horror sci-fi kind of title. So somehow we're talking about misery, and somehow, I don't know why I said comisery. And I said, well, is that a word? He says, no, it's not a word, but it kind of works. So we just took that title because, we kind of coined a new word for it. And it is about these group of friends that are commiserating, commiserating together, and but also we want to frame it as a comedy because it sounds like it's a dark title, but at the same time it's supposed to be funny. It's kind of like zany and crazy.
Yeah.
So that's how it happened.
I think something that, and I'm curious if this has been the case for either of you, being able to commiserate with friends during this moment, because it is such an unprecedented thing. Nobody quite knows how to navigate it. So I'll start off with B, and then I'll ask Quentin about how you personally have been able to kind of cope with this particular time that we're in. Not even necessarily within the context of the film, but just as B the person.
Well, I feel like Be the Person is never really entirely a thing of his own. I think Be the Person is like, a mixture of being an artist, being an activist, being a thinker, an advocate for social justice. And so I feel like, when I speak from Be, I speak through all of those different channels. And I think this time really made me reckon with and I'm sure with many others, what it means to be an artist during this time of heightened political contradictions. I have learned to really believe that the work that we do as artists speaks directly to and influences the politics, the zeitgeist, the justice. And part of why this work to me is so important is because it is us as artists raising a set of moral questions. It is us working through the trauma of our country, of the world, and it's an expression of how we are reconciling and building a new sense of morality. And so I truly believe that, this moment for me, art has been one way of coping with everything. It's, I think it's never sort of divorced from the kind of work that we can do on the ground, on the streets, fighting in the Twin Cities for, Black Lives Matter. Twin Cities is where I'm from. North Minneapolis is the neighborhood that is just pretty abuts South Minneapolis, which is where the incident happened and where so much of the movement now began. I think there's this really interesting quote by Prince, who is from the Twin Cities. He said, who would have thought that the revolution would begin in Minnesota? And, it's been an interesting time to see how we are navigating all of this as artists, as people who are committed to social justice. So that for me has been one way of coping with all of this, and just realizing my place and the larger and national conversation around anti-racism work, the movement for Black Lives Matter, and of course, pushing back against the anti-Asianism that has sort of begun since the pandemic first was announced back in early this year.
Yeah. I think it's very difficult unless we allow ourselves the moment to reflect, to understand that all those things have happened, right? Like that we've gone through this social movement, specifically with regards to Black Lives Matter, that we've come to this idea that there's a lot of bigotry, a lot of discrimination towards a lot of communities of color, towards a lot of queer people in the world. And it all just seems to have come to a head right at the same time that we're told to be indoors this entire time. Quentin, I know a lot of the past few weeks have been spent putting together the film and making it available to us. But when you weren't working on the film or even conceiving the film, how difficult or how easy was this idea of sticking inside and kind of being a part of that moment for yourself?
I hate to confess, but I have never really locked myself down. So basically my background is I was from Hong Kong, and basically we've already had a preview of COVID, which was SARS back in 2003 or something. And again, like, it's so sad that it's like, some doctor from Guangzhou came to Hong Kong, and then he spread SARS all over the city. But because of SARS, Hong Kong people were very vigilant about that, and just like, people willing to wear masks, and basically all those, like, sterilizing, the doorknobs and all that stuff is already instituted since SARS. So that's why Hong Kong wasn't hit as hard. So for me, it was like I always kept active as much as, I mean, obviously I never threw any like huge parties, like, 20, 30 people party, but, I really kind of like be very selective about like meeting my friends, and then I would still go back to the office to work. And for I think the first 2 months, I have a son, so my 4-year-old son. So it was pretty tough because he couldn't go to school. So he couldn't go to daycare because I had to hire a nanny full time so that I could actually, keep working basically.
Mm-hmm.
But my professor actually sent me this article about Newton, who never really stopped working on the pandemic, and he actually made use of the time. So that's what I was trying to do, is I was just, I was basically using all the time to try to, like, I realized that it's a great time because most actors are not working. So it's not that hard to reach out to them. So I have like 2 TV projects, I have like a feature. So I was able to package all these movies and get actors to read script really, when they are actually down and have downtime. And so for me, I just basically try to keep it myself as active as possible, but still within, socially distant guidelines, and not do any crazy parties and things like that. But
Mm-hmm.
So I really haven't released. And then eventually my son, I think like end of April, the daycare opens again, and I basically put him back into daycare, because I know that a lot of parents are uncomfortable, but the reality is that, I really don't have any choice. I'm like kind of like an essential worker. So if the daycare doesn't open, I just have to find
You're in a
some other
very
way
tough
to take care of the
position.
kid. Yeah. So, but I feel like I've been lucky. So just because I feel like I've been living the right lifestyle, just by wearing masks and doing socially distant, and be very selective about the contacts that I meet. So that I've been, I'm still negative. So I've tested in May, I've tested in July. I'm also tested just last week. So far I've been negative. And I know that was a little scary between B and I, because what happened was that when we were shooting Comisery, B just moved into his place, and there wasn't any kind of like, furniture, whatever. So I said, hey, why don't you we shoot your set? So I decorated a room in my house, and then make it the protagonist's house. And so he would come over, and I think he went to a couple of protests, and then until he showed up and he was like all masked up. I said, what's going on? He said, oh, I think I might, I'm not sure, I'm exposed, blah, blah. I have a bit of a cough. So then, but I said, but at the end he got tested, he's fine. So, I feel like, but I would do the same thing anyway. So I would sterilize the computer. So low budget. He was using my computer too. So sterilized computer after sterilized computer before. And it's just like, it's a little bit more inconvenient, I'd say, than your usual lifestyle. But and yeah, you have to wear a mask because that's really the best way to prevent the spread of the disease. And yeah, but what I thought was very interesting in the beginning was that I think even in March, my parents in Hong Kong were telling me, "Oh, you should wear masks and stuff like that." And somehow, even CDC wasn't saying that, "Oh, not masks is not really useful." And I remember that a lot of Asians, some of my Asian friends are more cautious. They were wearing masks outside, and somehow by wearing a mask, a lot of people think that you're sick or you're like, there's just this stigma about wearing masks. I don't know what's going on. So it wasn't really until I'd say April that, when people saying that, yeah, you need to wear a mask and stuff like that, then that becomes a little bit more normalized in LA. I'm not sure what it's like for the rest of the world, but I know that even in Orange County, like people have problems wearing masks. It's like, it's not that big of a deal,
It really isn't. It's just a matter of like,
yeah.
what can you do to take care of yourself? If they're telling you that this is one of the ways to do it, just do it. And like, listen to the people who actually know what they're talking about. And it's interesting because I do want to talk about an element that's, one, in keeping with what Bee's talking about, where the moment we're in right now, socially and politically. But also, it's very much a part of Zoom, which is Zoom bombing. And there's a particular Zoom bomber who plays a role in the film. And the first time we encounter the Zoom bomber, he's wearing a Trump shirt. And so I'm curious about, one, Quentin, the decision to have that be how we receive this character. And two, I'm going to talk to Bee a little bit about kind of what it was like to make sure that was part of it. But Quentin, if you could talk a little bit about making sure that we knew that he was a Trumper.
Yeah, so we actually had a little bit of a debate about whether to wear the Trump shirt or not, because I think Adi really felt like that he wanted the series to be more kind of like apolitical or just not, it's not necessarily set in this time. So it'd be a little bit more timeless. But for me, I felt like it was really important to basically, we know what we're talking about. So it is important, I think, for his character to wear this Trump shirt. So actually so again, like the actor was actually in Arizona, who was actually a childhood friend of mine, Richard. And we worked together when we were teenagers. I was directing a play. He was 14, I was like 17. We were both in Montreal. Then he moved out to Arizona. We always talk about working together, never had a chance. And finally, because of this pandemic, I finally could cast him playing this racist guy in Arizona, and I was directing in LA. So I remember I had to he has a bunch of props that I want to give him. But first, he has he was wearing the Trump T-shirt. Then his character eventually, because he got possessed by the virus, he suddenly opened up and become like he was wearing a Black Lives Matter T-shirt. So those two T-shirts, I think I had to I bought on Amazon. I've sent it to I had to send it to Arizona for him to wear. It's but I think that it is important because for me, it's really important to sort of frame this with the kind of historical specificity that is happening now. I think that's important for me to make this comment. And also, originally we weren't supposed to have Danny the character because Danny was supposed to be dead. And somehow I thought, wow, because the Black Lives Matter happened, let's just cast my African-American actor friend who actually we went to Yale together. And so I just called him, hey, do you want to do this? And then I showed him the script and he said, okay, great. So we cast him more for 2 episodes. So that was just so much, I guess, when we're creating this whole Comisery script, there's so much we're actually just reacting to what happened, and literally Black Lives Matter happened as well. Oh, let's put it in. And so I think that's really fun. I think I've never done that before.
I mean, I think to speak to the moment of where we're at and also the politics of where we're at, part of politics is the politicization of personhood and identity. And so something that I mentioned at the top that it was very exciting about the film is the fact that Bee's character identifies as non-binary. We find out about their partner. We find out about kind of the storyline behind that. But Bee, what was it like making sure to exercise that particular storyline and let people know that this is an identity that is prevalent in the world that we should be aware of, and that it can be kind of an informative topic even within the context of a sci-fi comedy?
For sure. I agree that there were a lot of layers and complexities that I wanted to bring into this character with the understanding of what that particular identity was, and of course being respectful in the portrayal of non-binary identity. So much of my training as an undergrad and as a student of gender and sexuality studies, as well as reading and paying attention to trans thinkers and the trans movement recently, is to acknowledge the ways that they have the work has been done to allow us to start thinking about the ways that we can delink biological and anatomical sex from gender as being a social construct, what Judith Butler calls a thing without an original. And so, you know, for me, thinking through that, I wanted to also question the ways that my own gender performance, gender identification sort of allowed me to understand the character. And, you know, for sure, as male presenting as I am, I will say that I don't experience my gender in even ways either. You know, I don't feel more masculine or more feminine in either, in any context. And I don't think that, you know, my anatomical and biological sex determines the ways that I can express my gender, or be able to identify my gender a certain way. And so I think for me, that was the starting point for building the character in a way that was respectful, in a way that also spoke truth to my own experience as, you know, as an Asian American person, as an Asian American male presenting person who, you know, in the context of US and American racial ideology, has never had a very scrutable sexuality or gender. And, you know, like we know this from all of the, you know, Asian studies, or from Orientalism, from Edward Said's study of Orientalism to Asian American studies, that, you know, Asian male has never been a transparent thing historically. You know, like I've always found it fascinating that, like, in the ways that Edward Said can talk about how Asia or the Orient is feminized, and yet on the front cover of Orientalism, the book, it's a picture of a little young boy who is wrapped around by a snake, which is, you know, already, as we know, like pretty much of an allegory about the, you know, about gender roles there. So anyway, like that, you know, makes me think a lot about the ways that, like, I come to an understanding about my gender. And in many ways, I do identify as non-binary myself. You know, I definitely would say that I am not trans-identifying, and so that's why I was comfortable playing this character as a non-binary character.
Everything you just said was such a wonderful way in which, for our listeners or for anybody who doesn't quite understand how people approach certain things, especially as actors, like sometimes we wonder, why did they decide to go with this role? Why did they decide to make these choices? And the information that you equip yourself with in order to tackle this role and to kind of figure out your own journey is such a fascinating thing. And thank you for talking about that and sharing that. I think there's different ways to approach some really fascinating conversations that have just come up with the times right now. And I love that a particular conversation we're having is about exploring and embracing this fluidity of identity, regardless of what it is. So I'm very grateful and glad that it's something that's explored in the course of the movie, which I do want to remind our listeners. So the movie is going to be available on AsianAmericanMovies.com and then eventually on Amazon Prime. So that way you can view it there. But again, the actor in the film, Bee Vang, and also the director, Quentin Lee, thank you both for joining me for this conversation about Comisery and about the artistic process and kind of just being able to make things work at this moment. Thank you both.
Thank you. I have a lot of fun.
Thank you.